I would perhaps most succinctly narrow it down to two things. Control carbs. Now, again, I'm not saying you can't eat any, but the better you're able to control your insulin, the more easily it's going to be for your body to lose weight. And if you need that even one step simpler, don't get your carbs from bags and boxes with barcodes. Eat whole fruits and vegetables, enjoy them, steam them, stew them, whatever. Eat them, don't drink them. And then the second one is at least 6 times a week, engage in some form of resistance training.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls around the world? I'd like to welcome you back to the Real Talk with Zuby podcast. On today's episode, we have got on another special guest. He is a brilliant man. He is a professor of cell biology at BYU, and he's also the author of a couple books, including Why We Get Sick and How to Not Get Sick. And this is Benjamin Bikman. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Zuby. Thanks, man.
Great to have you on. Ben, I've done a brief intro right there, but for those who are not familiar with you and your work, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned the part that gives me the most qualifications to go on these metabolic topics that we'll be discussing. I'm a professor at BYU, so up in the heart of Utah in the Rocky Mountains. And ski season has just started, which is a good time for my wife and her hobbies. But my main priority is, in addition to having a teaching assignment, which I really enjoy, I am the head of the Metabolism Research Lab, and I study metabolic disorders with the particular focus on fat cells. So I very much embrace this idea that much of metabolic disorders begins in the fat cell in a way that perhaps most people don't appreciate, but then connecting that to chronic disease. So what is it about that fat mass that is increasing the risk of disease? And that brings me to my explicit focus, which is insulin resistance as a topic of expertise. So that's my day job. But of course, I'm husband and father, number one.
Awesome. I love that. So metabolic health is a massive problem, particularly in the USA, but in many parts of the world. With that said, I don't think it's something that people are very familiar with. You know, people know what obesity means, but when people think or hear the term metabolic health, I feel like it doesn't really register in most people's brains unless you're someone who's particularly into sports science and nutrition. So can you explain what metabolic health even is?
Oh, yeah, for sure. In fact, that's a great way to start the conversation because metabolic health is a vague term and defining it is helpful. Now, there could be a number of ways to define it. I define it based on one way would be based on the definition of the metabolic syndrome. People have heard the metabolic syndrome before, which is this constellation of problems that tend to clump together, like having central obesity, so having more fat stored in the center of the body, having high blood glucose levels, high blood pressure, and then dyslipidemia, so triglycerides and HDL cholesterol are off. Those are the problems that are clumped together in what we call the metabolic syndrome. But then to take that to the next level, that's still a little vague, where a person may hear the term metabolic syndrome and not appreciate where it comes from. And so we have to go back in time a little bit to identify the term that it used to be known. So what we call the metabolic syndrome used to be called the insulin resistance syndrome. And that, I think, is a more precise title because it tells us what those problems have in common or what the origin of those problems is. And so my definition of metabolic health is that spectrum of insulin resistance to insulin sensitivity. And that, in other words, how well is the hormone insulin working in your body? And people may think that that is an overly simplistic view. It is admittedly simple, but it is profound because insulin is the absolute master of all metabolic processes in the body. That while there are other hormones that influence metabolic processes, and by that I mean nutrient metabolism, what is the body doing with fats or glucose or ketones or lactate? That's what I mean by metabolic processes or nutrient metabolism. There are various hormones that influence this, like thyroid hormone or cortisol, but none have the power, the sheer mass of relevance that insulin has. And so while it seems simplistic, it is very precise and accurate. So metabolic health to me is an estimation or a measurement of someone's insulin resistance. So how insulin resistant you are is a way of answering how metabolically healthy you are. And as you noted, it is a problem in the US, but I know you are based in UAE. You're in Dubai, I believe. Beautiful place. I was just there a couple months ago giving a talk on this very topic. Some of the most insulin resistant countries on the planet. In fact, as of a few years ago, 9 of the top 10 were in the Middle East. So, as much as the US has a metabolic problem, we're not even in the top 10. And in fact, Singapore, the beautiful Southeast Asia country, rounds out those top 10 countries. And there's interesting differences across ethnicities, but that once again comes to fat cells. But it all still comes back to insulin resistance. So I believe the most precise way to talk about metabolic health and measure metabolic health is to view it through the lens of insulin resistance.
This episode is brought to you by Sambrosa, the best way to get your 8 hours of rest. If, like me, you sometimes struggle with nighttime restlessness and allergies, then Sambrosa Night Syrup could be a game changer for you. Sambrosa contains a natural base of 7 organic herbs, honey, and a small amount of antihistamine. It's effective and soothing with no harsh chemicals, no high fructose corn syrup, and no artificial flavors or dyes. I've been using Sambrosa for several months now, and I can personally vouch for its effectiveness when it comes to improving my quality of rest at night. I also love the fact that they're a family-owned company who share my values of faith, freedom, and integrity. My listeners can try Sambrosa today and get 10% off by going to sambrosa.com/Zuby10. That's SAMBROSA.com/Zuby10 for 10% off your order. Try Sambrosa today and wake up ready to embrace life's opportunities. Go to sambrosa.com/Zuby10 and try it out. Okay, I've got a couple questions because I'm surprised by some of that data. I'm not surprised by the Gulf countries. I'm definitely surprised by Singapore. What is it, in your opinion, that makes those nations the most metabolically unhealthy when it comes to insulin resistance?
Yeah. In fact, Zuby, if you'll allow me, let me just define insulin resistance as much as I've described it as a good indicator of metabolic health. Very, very simply, insulin resistance is a pathology with two parts, or it's like a coin with two sides. That on one side of this coin, it is the phenomenon that you think of when you think of insulin resistance, which is that the hormone insulin isn't quite working the way it ought to. Now, that's not a universal effect in the body, or to say that all another way, in some cells or some tissues, insulin's working well. So the little humble hormone comes and knocks on the door of the cell, and the cell answers and does what insulin wants it to do. But in other tissues, in other parts of the body, insulin comes and knocks on the door, but the cell isn't answering. So that's one part of insulin resistance, but you have to appreciate the second part, which is that insulin levels are chronically elevated. That's a condition that we call hyperinsulinemia. So insulin isn't working very well and blood insulin levels are elevated. Those two things are inseparable. They must come together. And this is one of the reasons why one of the drums that I beat the loudest is the need to measure insulin itself. That it is very uncommon for a clinician to even think of measuring insulin. They've been so trained to only look at blood sugar levels and not to realize that insulin is its own character. And in fact, blood glucose is the sidekick. If you want to look at the main person of the story, it is insulin. So you need to measure insulin to have the best view of insulin resistance. Now, why is it that we see these differences worldwide? In fact, the differences have become so apparent that after my PhD in the US, I went to Singapore to do my postdoctoral fellowship work. So within the hard sciences, before you can get hired as a professor and run your own lab, getting a PhD is not enough. You have to do what's called a postdoc, or this fellowship period. And Duke University, which is in North Carolina in the US, actually opened up a collaborative medical school with the National University of Singapore because of Singapore's interest in getting a better understanding of the metabolic health quirks that you see at a global level. And that is in part diet related, and it is in part genetic predisposition. And so it's the genetic predisposition that becomes relevant because more and more the what we used to call the American diet or the Western diet, it is the global diet. You know, when I'm in Dubai, I'm amazed at how much sugar and sweets everyone's eating. It very much feels sort of American. It is a very American um, eating uh, pattern or diet to have so much sugar. But even in Singapore, where my family lived and one of our children was born there, we love that country. There is so much sugar. There's so many sweet shops and baking shops and everything else. So that global diet is more and more common, which is that we are constantly consuming carbohydrates. The global diet is about 70% carbohydrate, and we've been given this asinine advice to eat 6 times a day. And the more someone's eating refined carbohydrates, the more insulin is going up because blood glucose spikes. And so insulin spikes to try to correct the blood glucose. But insulin can stay elevated for 3 to 5 hours. And so a person is eating so often, and it's always refined starches and sugars, that the insulin is elevated. And as much as I just described elevated insulin as a fundamental portion or function of insulin resistance, it's also the primary cause. Too much insulin is driving insulin resistance. Now it comes to the genetic aspect, which is how well does a body store fat? And this gets a little nuanced, but as much as we focus on body fat as a mass, it's actually that is less relevant. It's not the mass of fat that a body has. It's actually the size of each individual fat cell. This explains why even across the sexes we see differences. Women are naturally fatter than men, and yet they're more metabolically healthy than men. Men have, to say that all another way, men are leaner than women, and yet men are much more likely to have insulin resistance and all of its consequences like type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, etc. That's because men have a lower potential to make new fat cells. And this is kind of getting to the heart of the ethnic differences and the genetics that come with it. So if you look at a body, you can ask yourself, how many fat cells can that body make? Because if it this is a bit of it's a bit of a paradox, because if you have a body that can continue to make fat cells, especially in what's called the subcutaneous fat, that's the fat that we store beneath our skin, the fat that we can pinch or jiggle, that's a very healthy place to store fat and where we generally can make new fat cells. A person that can make new fat cells, they may be gaining more fat mass, but each individual fat cell is actually quite small. And small fat cells are healthy fat cells. They're very insulin sensitive and they're anti inflammatory. And inflammation is another cause of insulin resistance itself. But a body that has a limited potential to make fat cells, then any pressure to store fat because of calories and because of elevated insulin, you have to have elevated insulin to store fat. That's a different topic entirely. But if there's a pressure to store more fat, if you have fewer fat cells, then those fat cells have to get bigger and bigger. And fat cells are very problematic. They become very insulin resistant to try to stop growing, and they become very pro-inflammatory to try to change the blood flow. That itself is a different topic. But suffice it to say, the more a body has a potential to make new fat cells, the more it can store fat in a healthy way, which is storing it in the fat cells. The lower potential or the lower the threshold is to store fat, in other words, the body can't make fat cells very well, the more those fat cells start to become overloaded, then they become pathogenic and start promoting insulin resistance throughout the body, because now the body has to start storing fat in other places, like in the liver or the pancreas or the muscle, etc. And that's just all more of the obvious consequences of insulin resistance. And it begins to contribute more and more to the insulin resistance itself. So across Arabic populations, so we could look at a spectrum almost, if you will, Zuby, where on one end we have sort of Caucasian Northern Europeans. That appears to be the ethnicity that can store the most fat and yet be the healthiest, and we see this in the US. The US is among the fattest countries on the planet. And yet if you look at its rate of type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, it's lower. It's maybe in the top 20, maybe not even in the top 20. And yet it is among the fattest. And that's because the US is predominantly Caucasian. Northern European or Caucasian ethnicities, perhaps due to the sort of evolutionary adjustments where my ancestors were used to living in further from the equator, and which means it's going to have less sunlight, so I need to be able to make vitamin D more easily, but it's also going to be colder, and so I need to have more subcutaneous fat mass. So if I store my fat beneath my skin, it's more of an insulator. But then across these ethnic, that's all speculation, of course. Everything with evolution is.
Mhm.
That's trying to make sense of this spectrum. Then on the other end, you have East Asian and maybe Southeast Asian ethnicities, and then Arabic and Hispanic, and then African, and then again, sort of Caucasian. So it's all this spectrum. But on that far end, you have like East Asian and Southeast Asian. They have the absolute lowest potential to store fat, which means a little bit of fat gain in the East Asian or Southeast Asian body goes a long way. And so to say,
Mhm.
maybe to wrap all of this up, if you had two identical men, these two college roommates, one Caucasian, one East or Southeast Asian, and they were identical body mass, identical body fat percent, everything was the same, and they gained 20 pounds of fat over the next 10 years, which is actually kind of a pretty normal amount of fat gain nowadays. And they get back together for their 10-year college reunion. The Caucasian version of these roommates is totally fine. He's just 20 pounds fatter. He doesn't look as good in his Speedo. But you put that same 20 pounds of fat on his Southeast Asian roommate, his best pal. That guy has type 2 diabetes. He has fatty liver disease. He has erectile dysfunction, hypertension, all of the consequences of insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction because he couldn't make new fat cells. So any of his remaining any of his fat cells he had, the number stayed the same, but the size changed. Whereas the Caucasian, the fat cells got a little bigger and then they reproduced or multiplied. They get a little bigger, then they multiply. So that's the difference between hyperplasia, the ability to make new fat cells, which is a healthy way of gaining fat, and the other side being hypertrophy, which is when the number of fat cells is limited, and so any growth of fat mass is happening through the expansion of the fat cell itself.
This podcast is brought to you in part by Stash. Are you still putting off saving and investing because you'll get to it someday? Stash turns someday into today. Stash isn't just an investing app, it's a registered investment advisor that combines automated investing with dependable financial strategies to help you reach your goals faster. They'll provide you with personalized advice on what to invest in based on your goals. Or if you just want to sit back and watch your money go to work, you can opt into their award-winning, expert-managed portfolio that picks stocks for you. Stash has helped millions of Americans reach their financial goals, and it starts at just $3 per month. Don't let your savings sit around. Make it work harder for you. Go to get.stash.com/Zuby to see how you can receive $25 towards your first stock purchase and to view important disclosures. That's get.stash.com/Zuby. Paid non-client endorsement. Not representative of all clients and not a guarantee. Investment advisory services offered by Stash Investments, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Investing involves risk and investments may lose value. Offer is subject to T&Cs. Awesome. I've just learned two new things. I'm definitely more knowledgeable than the average person on this topic, but I didn't realize that larger, I didn't realize that larger fat cells were more unhealthy than smaller ones. I know that um, people can gain fat either by the cells multiplying or by them growing. I knew that, but I didn't know that the bigger ones were more unhealthy. And I didn't realize just how strong the ethnic component is as to whether fat is stored subcutaneously or viscerally, and what the health outcomes can be when it comes to metabolic health in that regard. That's very fascinating because I think obviously we tend to focus a lot on obesity itself and body weight itself and BMI and these type of things, and these additional factors I think are rarely looked at. You're actually the first person I've ever heard talk about it. So yeah, well, that's enlightening.
This is one of the reasons why liposuction is on one hand so successful at lowering body fat because you're literally sucking out the body fat. And yet, because
Mhm.
metabolic health and insulin resistance is not a function of fat mass, but the number of fat cells, this is why there's no improvement in any cardiometabolic outcome. So, studies that have looked at people post liposuction, so when you're sucking out the fat, they find that, again, while there is a significant loss of fat mass, years as you follow these people, no cardiometabolic outcome improves. Their insulin resistance is the same, their risk of type 2 diabetes is the same. In fact, what happens is the person simply starts to store the fat more in the fat tissue where they didn't lose fat, which means those fat cells may be getting
Mm.
bigger. They may be making things worse. No study has gone that long. But if it were just fat mass, liposuction would cure all of the ills associated with fat mass, and yet it doesn't fix anything. Everything, the person's just as metabolically sick or insulin resistant as they were before they had those several kilograms
Mm.
of fat sucked out of their bodies.
Hey, it's a new year and we're all about setting goals and actually hitting them. What you fuel your body with matters, and that's why I want to talk about today's sponsor, Huel. Huel. Their Black Edition ready to drink is a complete meal in a bottle. High in protein, low in sugar, and packed with all the nutrients you need to perform at your best. I'm constantly traveling and don't always have the luxury of meal prepping. So I'm a big fan of the Black Edition ready to drink. Each handy bottle has a whopping 35 grams of protein and 27 vitamins and minerals. So I can get healthy, satisfying nutrition even when I'm on the go. Right now, new customers can get 15% off plus a free gift using my exclusive link. Go to Huel.com, that's HUEL.com/Zuby, and use the code Zuby at checkout. Start your year off strong. Unlock a healthier, easier way to eat with Huel. Nutritionally complete meals in minutes so you can focus on what really matters. One more time, that's Huel.com/Zuby. Go check it out. So, in terms of metabolic, poor metabolic health, and the rise in what you call metabolic syndrome, what are the, I guess, number one, what are the trends in this regard, nationally and internationally? And what are the real world impacts of those trends?
Well, it's not good. Unfortunately, insulin resistance, which I'm invoking now, explicitly, calling in metabolic health what it is. Insulin resistance is the single most common health disorder worldwide, which is why I've focused on it. In fact, it's been an interesting evolution of my own sort of professional pursuits. I began studying insulin resistance because I thought it was no more relevant than explaining why obesity was connected to type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is the kind of the ultimate end result of insulin resistance, where insulin's most famous effect is to control blood glucose. If glucose goes up, that becomes harmful. If it stays elevated, insulin goes up, opens the doors for glucose to go out of the blood into the cells, and then insulin comes back down. Insulin resistance is the state where you need more and more insulin, but it's sufficient to keep the glucose in check. And then type 2 diabetes is when, even though there's this much insulin, now you can't keep the glucose in check anymore. This is type 2 diabetes. And as much as we have type 2 diabetes as an outcome that people focus on, we need to appreciate that the more we have a glucose centric paradigm of metabolic health, the more we're going to miss what's happening here, which is the elevated insulin. Because if you are only looking at the glucose, it can take 10 to 20 years. There are prospective studies to show this, that insulin can have been elevated, a sign of insulin resistance, for 10 or 20 years before the glucose ever starts to change. So imagine the impact if we could shift away from our glucose obsession to at least encompass insulin. I'm not saying ignore glucose, but let's include insulin in these measurements, and we could detect the problem far, far sooner. So a study within the United States suggests that up to 88% of adults in the US are somewhere further on that spectrum of insulin resistance by measuring some of the markers of the metabolic or insulin resistance syndrome. And as I've suggested, it's probably even worse. Those numbers are worse throughout the Middle East in particular, and East and Southeast Asia, for reasons that I've elaborated on earlier. So this is the most common problem worldwide, and the trends worldwide continue to be very sobering, which is it continues to go up. Now, for the first time ever in the United States, there appears to be a plateau and perhaps even a downward trend. And this could be the result of a handful of things, including more people getting what's called metabolic surgeries or gastric bypass. In fact, Puerto Rico just approved that the government will now fund or pay for all gastric bypass procedures because people have become so enamored by it. However, with the explosion of these weight loss drugs, in particular these GLP-1 receptor agonists, and if that doesn't sound familiar, the drug may, which is semaglutide, and if semaglutide doesn't sound familiar, the brand name will, which is Ozempic and Wegovy. Those have been shown to indeed be so effective with weight loss that we may be seeing a bit of this plateau. Now, I don't mean for any of that to sound like I'm an advocate of any of those. Indeed, I'm not. Although there's more nuance in me just being universally opposed to them. But that's a topic that I don't want to push us into quite yet. But as much as the problem does globally appear to still be going up, in some countries, with more aggressive use of surgeries and medications, that it does appear that we've sort of reached a plateau. But I confess, it's probably a temporary plateau. If those are the strategies we are going to be relying on, we're not actually solving the problem. It's a very temporary fix, and I am absolutely certain all we're doing is kicking the problem down the road, and we're going to have to face it eventually.
So my assumption, and maybe there's more to it, is just people are eating too many carbs, in particular sugar, compared to their activity levels. Is it that simple, or is there something much deeper going on here?
Yeah, well, Zuby, it is simple, and you've touched on it, perhaps even better than you think you have, because most people want to say the way to lose weight is just two things: eat less, exercise more. And boy, it sounds so seductively simple, and yet it doesn't work. In fact, anyone, when the audience listens to this, let me just explain why. Let's imagine, Zuby and I are getting together. We are hosting a metabolic summit, and as a part of this, there's going to be an all-you-can-eat buffet. That would be a dumb thing to have at a metabolic summit, but let's just go with it. And we've invited the world's most famous chefs to prepare the most delicious foods, and everyone who comes is going to want to enjoy a little bit of everything. So come hungry, because there's going to be so much to enjoy. What would you do, audience? What would you do to come as hungry to this event as possible? Probably you'd do two things. In the day or 2 days or 3 days before this event, where we've told you, come hungry, you're going to want to eat some of everything. It's so delicious. You probably exercise a little harder, and you'd probably eat a little less, and it would work. And it's the holiday season now here in the US. Everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about. As you start to prepare for Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner, you're going to be more mindful. You're going to purposely eat a little less, and you're going to exercise a little more, and it will work. You will go to that event as much hungrier than you would otherwise. But that's why that 60 years of advice has failed us so miserably. By telling a patient to eat less and exercise more, yes, there will be a temporary gain, but it will be temporary because hunger always wins. And so the weight loss strategy has to be focused where the first step. So let me pause that description and I'll come right back to it. There are two necessary components for weight gain, both of which must be met. The traditional view is that it's only calories, that it's purely just thermodynamics. Eat less, exercise more. If you're putting in more than you're putting out, you're going to gain weight. That is not true. I can prove that wrong easily and have published papers on this, because you have to have the other component, which is elevated insulin. So just to put a fine point on this, right down the hallway in my laboratory right now here in my university, I have students growing fat cells in little petri dishes. And those fat cells are swimming in a little broth of calories. They have thousands of calories available to them in the form of glucose and fats, which is all a fat cell wants when it comes to growing fat. And yet the fat cells stay skinny and small. Even though there's tons of calories, why aren't they getting fat? Because the fat cell needs to be told what to do. When we have to appreciate that within the context of the human body, the cells need to know how they can play well with each other. They need a conductor. so that, like in a symphony, the brass section needs to know when it's time for them to be louder than the woodwinds or than the strings. There needs to be a conductor to help everything be coordinated. Because what if the fat cells shouldn't be taking in energy at any given moment? Maybe the muscle cells need more energy because we're exercising. We wouldn't want to be storing energy in fat cells when we exercise. We want to be mobilizing it. So that's where hormones come in. And I can go back to those same little fat cells in the petri dish, sprinkle in a little insulin, and I can literally come back within an hour and all of a sudden they're fatter. I can come back an hour later than that and they're fatter still. So it's insulin that tells the fat cell what to do with the energy that it has. And so, thus, both conditions must be met. There must be elevated insulin, and then to signal the fat cell to grow. And then there must be sufficient calories to fuel that growth. If you try to have one without the other, the person dies. Like, let's say, for example, let's go to the extreme moment, and we can see this in humans. If you have a type 1 diabetic and they can eat 10,000 calories of chocolate cake, and if they choose to skip their insulin injection, they will stay as skinny as possible. Now, it's lethal. They're dying. Their blood glucose levels are 10 times higher than they should be. They're getting into ketoacidosis. So their body is dying, but they stay as skinny as they want because in the absence of insulin, there can be no fat storage. So to hell with thermodynamics, the body's just wasting energy. It's breathing out energy. It's urinating out energy. Metabolic rate goes
Out
up.
of curiosity there, just so I better understand, in that situation with a type 1 diabetic, what is the mechanism through which that would eventually result in their death?
Yeah. Great question. In fact, it's worth elaborating lest anyone become tempted to try this. So this is so known that it's a condition that is called diabulimia. Diabulimia is this term, of course, adopted from the eating disorder world, where the type 1 diabetic is deliberately underdosing insulin to stay thin. So I mentioned the two mechanisms, but I'll elaborate on them. So hyperglycemia, when the blood glucose levels, I'm going to invoke milligrams per deciliter, just because of my American sort of training. But other people
Mhm.
worldwide may be thinking of this in molarity, molar units. So normal fasting blood glucose is generally considered to be about 80 milligrams per deciliter, or about 4 millimolar. But in the untreated type 1 diabetic, that can get up to 7, 8, 900 milligrams per deciliter. And when it gets that high, the person starts to urinate profusely because the glucose is creating this what's called an osmotic pull, so stripping the body of all of its water. So the person will start to feel faint and may have a low enough blood pressure that they can't keep the brain perfused with blood, and then they are going unconscious. So that's one obvious consequence of it. But at the same time, when glucose is that high, it's activating a process called glycation, where the glucose begins irreversibly binding to amino acids. And this can happen everywhere in the body, which mounts a substantial inflammatory response. And it can just destroy cells. Red blood cells stop functioning very well when they undergo glycation. So that can just damage tissues. So that's one aspect. And then, which is, again, the high glucose, 10 times higher than it ought to be. The body cannot deal with that for long. And then second would be the ketoacidosis. And that's an opportunity for me maybe to describe ketones, so that people appreciate them, because right now I'm describing them as a uniform villain, and that is absolutely not fair. My lab has published multiple reports, in addition to dozens of labs around the world who've done the same. Ketones are remarkable molecules. So to demystify them briefly, a ketone is simply a product of a lot of fat burning. That when the liver in particular is burning a lot of fat, that there are instances like when insulin is low if it's a low carb diet or fasting, or zero if it's the untreated type 1 diabetic. When insulin goes lower and lower, the liver cells and the body by extension cannot stop burning fat. There's no way to stop it. Fat burning just keeps going, keeps going. Even if in the case of the liver, maybe the liver cell has met all of its own energetic needs. The liver is saying, I need this much energy. And the liver cell is saying, okay, that's going to come from fat because insulin's not here to tell me to stop burning fat. But in the absence of insulin, it can't stop burning fat. And so now the liver cell is essentially burning more fat than it needs for its own metabolic demands. And that excess is ketogenesis, or the production of ketones. Now, so ketones are their own caloric source. The brain, any cell with mitochondria, muscle cells, fat cells, even brain cells, especially, burn ketones and use them very readily. Ketones are very viable fuel. More and more endurance athletes are using. BYU just won the cross country national championships in men's and women's cross country, and they take ketone supplements. More and more people are doing this. So ketones are fuel source, but every time you make a ketone, you have to buffer a little bit of acid. Now, at normal levels, like if you and I were fasting for 2 days, we would get into ketosis, but it never goes very far because we always have insulin. Even in a fasted state, there's always a little bit of insulin to keep ketogenesis in check. So we just get into a state called ketosis, where ketones are elevated, but it's not changing the pH. Acid base is still normal. It's well within a normal range. But in the absence of insulin, like back to the person with diabulimia, they've gone so far beyond this that now the body is, in fact, in what's a state called metabolic acidosis. Now
Mm.
the acidity in the body has become so substantial, or the pH has dropped so much, that you can start to have what's called protein unfolding. So proteins maintain their structure in part because of a certain pH, and proteins is that's what constitutes the majority of hormones, enzymes that are mediating biochemical reactions. Those are all proteins, and dozens of more parts that I'm not mentioning. As the pH gets so bad, all of those start to literally come apart, and so the body just stops
Mm.
working, and then death follows. So there was a lot in that answer, including
Wow.
how the person
So is
dies.
that if I remember my man, I haven't studied biology for a long time, but is that essentially like is that like a denaturing that
Yeah,
happens?
yeah, that's
So the
right.
enzymes get denatured
Yep,
because of the acid,
yep,
and
that's
so
exactly
they
right.
can
Yeah,
no
you
longer
can't
serve their
maintain.
function.
Yeah, that's right. You
Okay.
can't maintain that kind of coordinary structure where what's holding the
Mm.
folding together starts to unravel or denature.
Wow. Wow. Okay. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, this whole world is really fascinating to me. I mean, I've been into weight training and nutrition for 23 years at this point. I'm 38. I started out when I was 15. I used to play a lot of rugby and got really into my weight training and so on. And as you know, with so many of these things, there's so many things that kind of come from the world of strength training and bodybuilding and powerlifting, which, I always say that the bros are always like 10 to 20 years ahead of the mainstream. And it's just fascinating because you're explaining a lot of the science of it, and so much of it and so many things kind of running through my brain just click with so many things that I've already learned to be best practices. We haven't gone deep on fasting, but I mean, I've been doing intermittent fasting for 17 years. Um, and so it's kind of
Before it was
fascinating, even
cool.
when you were talking. Yeah, I started when I was 21, and when I first heard about it, I thought it was crazy.
Hmm.
I thought it was so weird because it went completely against the typical philosophy at the time, particularly in the bodybuilding world
Oh yeah.
about something again you touched on earlier. You got to eat 5, 6, 7 meals a day. You don't want to be going more than 2.5 hours or so without a meal. So you're just kind of constantly grazing and eating and eating and eating. So this idea of, oh my gosh, what I fast for like 16 to 20 hours a day, and then I just eat like I just eat two larger meals. I was there worried I'm going to lose my muscle. I'm not going to be able to make any gains, all this kind of stuff. And I mean, I guess I must be hyper insulin sensitive. So when you talk about the whole calories in, calories out, my understanding, I mean, it's interesting. You said that doesn't work. I would assume that there's a pretty big caveat there, which is that if you are metabolically healthy and you are insulin sensitive, then it works totally fine and that's all you need to do. But if you're in this state, which so many adults unfortunately now are, where they have high levels of insulin resistance, then they need to work on that aspect in conjunction with just the caloric
Hmm.
deficit in order for it to work. So this is kind of my bro science brain mixing with my science brain to try to see if what my brain's working through here is making sense.
Hmm.
Does that
Hmm.
sound about right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. In fact, that's a great opportunity for me to just provide a little more nuance, in addition to the kind of rant I went on earlier. But first and foremost, let me just clarify that while that my discussion, my talk on all of this is really intended to be for the overweight person who's struggling to improve their insulin resistance or metabolic health. That if you have a guy who's in the gym for 2 to 3 hours a day, and has just a tremendous amount of muscle mass, boy, they can have a very different approach to nutrition. But nonetheless, this is a good opportunity to clarify. I don't mean to claim that calories don't matter. Energy does matter, and it needs to be accounted for. But the traditional perspective, in fact, all of my long-winded explanation earlier was intended to kind of explain what I can now, which is that traditionally people look at a weight loss journey and only look at the calories without addressing the elevated insulin that allowed them to put those calories in their fat cells in the first place. That if a person has no insulin, where do all those calories go? Like in the diabulemic individual, it's because metabolic rate can go up substantially. In the absence of insulin, metabolic rate can go up by 20%, hundreds of calories a day, now just being spent because the body's just running hot. In my lab has shown that ketones increase metabolic rate in fat tissue by 3 times. This was from human fat biopsies. So metabolic rate in fat tissue is going up just to create more heat. So it's a very inefficient process, but it's a great way to be lean. So metabolic rate goes up, and then the person is, in the absence of insulin, wasting energy in the form of ketones being emitted in their breath. And remember, every ketone has a caloric value roughly comparable to glucose. So they're literally breathing out energy. And at the same time, they're urinating out energy because of the glucose that's being urinated and the ketones that are being urinated out. Those are both calorie molecules. So we can still reconcile thermodynamics. But the problem, again, with the traditional view, which is here's my weight loss journey. I need to lose 50 pounds of fat. I'm going to just cut my calories. If you don't address the underlying elevated insulin, now you've gone the opposite. So this was diabulimia, high calories, low insulin. Now what you're doing is you still have high insulin. And if you just drop your calories, but you haven't addressed the elevated insulin, you've put yourself in a position to stimulate substantial hunger, because if insulin's still elevated, it's wanting the body to be storing energy. If you look across all of the cells of the body and try to create a singular theme for insulin's effects, because it does affect every cell of the body, literally every cell. And I don't use that term literally too liberally like kids do these days. I mean, literally every single cell of the body responds to insulin. Insulin's thematic effect is it wants the cell to store energy. That's fine if you're a fat cell, even if you're a muscle cell, if you're a liver cell, because those cells have a great potential to store. Even the kidney, which has the highest metabolic rate in the body, can store glucose as glycogen. But the brain has a very limited potential for energy storage, and yet it has a very high metabolic rate. So the brain needs to be getting energy from the blood all the time. And if you have stopped eating or eating less, but your insulin's still high, you're going to have lower blood glucose and you're going to have lower ketones. And Dr. David Ludwig out of Harvard, he's published work on this, looking at the total energy availability. That's what he called it, energy availability, looking at all of the calories in the blood. And when insulin is high, energy availability in the blood goes down. And so the brain will sense this reduction in energy and it will start to say, hey, we're starting to run a little low, not knowing that the fat cell is loaded with energy, because when insulin is high, you can't mobilize that energy. The cell is forced to store it. And so the brain starts to worry, if you will, or sense this reduction in energy. And its solution to correct that reduction in energy is to stimulate hunger. So all of this is my long-winded way of saying the traditional view of the weight loss journey is I'm going to take my first step and it's going to be cutting my calories. No, all that does is stimulate hunger. Keep that foot firmly planted. Let the first step be I'm going to lower my insulin. If the first step is with the intention of lowering insulin, then you don't have to worry about calories. Indeed, don't count calories. It is a miserable, fruitless way of eating, and it robs you of all the pleasure of enjoying food because you're too anxious. Just or to say that it's all another way, manage your macros. There are three kind of fundamental pillars to lower insulin while not needing to worry about calories. The calories will take care of themselves. Eat when you're hungry. Don't eat if you're not hungry. But with regards to managing macros, control carbs. So try to avoid getting carbs from bags and boxes with barcodes. Eat whole fruits and vegetables. Eat them, don't drink them. That's the first step, control carbs. Number two, prioritize protein. Make sure you're getting a lot of high quality, and by high quality, I mean animal source protein. And then third, don't fear the fat that comes with that protein. That when you are eating protein in nature, all proteins in nature come with fat. That is how God designed them. Humans digest them better. So don't just get protein alone. You literally digest it better, and it is more anabolic. You will stimulate greater muscle growth by eating the fat with that protein than the protein alone. And so don't fear that fat. And because protein and fat have little to no effect on insulin, those are calories you can be more liberal with, or energy, food sources. That's why I say prioritize protein and don't fear fat. Control your carbs. So if you control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat, then you will lower your insulin. That first step is going to take you very, very far down the road of weight loss. And then if you get to a plateau and you feel like you still have more weight to lose, then you can look at that next step of calories. But even then, I do not advocate counting calories. That's where I say engage in structured frequent fasting, because now you're ready to fast more easily. Because if you have managed your macros and lowered your insulin, you're used to using your own energy, your own body fat for fuel. And so you're used to using your own fuel. And now it's easier to not eat all the time. So fasting becomes a little simpler. So that's my general guidance. Let the first step be lowering insulin, and then the calories will generally start to take care of themselves.
I feel like I have to add one more here because there's an gigantic tool in the arsenal that most people are not using, and it's called weight training.
Oh, yeah, of
For what
course.
for whatever reason, most people do not know that strength training, aka resistance training, aka lifting weights, increases insulin sensitivity. This is
Yes.
a major reason why men or women who lift weights can eat very differently and with very different results to those who don't. Like, people are always surprised and shocked by how many carbs I eat, right?
Hmm.
People have this assumption that I hate doing low or no carb dieting. Like,
Hmm.
I don't like it on anywhere. Like, I eat tons of carbs, like hundreds and hundreds of grams a day, and I've done that for a long time, and I stay lean, and my blood sugar, in fact, my blood sugar is a little bit low, but it's largely because of my activity level and my weight training. A big problem is you have so many people in all these developed countries who are basically eating like bodybuilders and powerlifters, but they're not lifting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well said.
Um, yeah, that's yeah, that seems to be pretty much what is happening.
No,
I
I
do have a
totally
question
agree.
about something you said. Okay, cool. I have a question about something you said just out of interest, because I noticed a couple of times you mentioned opposition to calorie counting. I'm personally, I'm a fan of calorie counting, particularly for people who have not done it before. Why are you opposed to it?
I'm opposed to it because I've just seen it fail so often, and I worry that it's focusing on the wrong metric. That while energy matters, if you are calorie counting, it's going to encourage you to fear fat. And that, I believe, is part of what's put us into the conundrum we find ourselves in. A part of what I think accounts for the explosion in obesity and metabolic disorders is, ironically, a fear of fat. That if you look at a percent of calories, our fat consumption has gone down in the past 50 or 60 years because of the kind of anti-fat view. But dietary fat is totally inert when it comes to insulin. In other words, there's no study that has done this, so I need to speculate, but I can speculate with some confidence. If someone were to eat 3,000 calories of butter, I doubt it would be, or 4,000 or 5,000, I doubt they could gain a single pound of fat on that because there would be no insulin effect. And so the body would increase its metabolic rate in the absence of an insulin spike, and it would be making ketones and uh, ejecting those ketones from the body, a way to reconcile thermodynamics. Because if insulin is low, you cannot store fat. So part of my opposition to calorie counting is that it encourages someone to avoid fat, which I do not agree with. Um, Fat is essential, and in fact, the less fat men in particular eat, the less manly they become, to sort of put it in a funny way. But when men avoid fat, especially saturated fat, testosterone levels drop, sperm quality
Mhm.
drops as well, and I mean, it literally makes men infertile, and that, I think,
Yep.
can explain part of what we see globally. There's a lot, of course, that goes into the reduction in fertility, a lot. But I think our fear of fat, especially animal fats, which contain saturated fats and cholesterol, I mean, good luck making sex hormones if you don't have enough cholesterol. All sex hormones are built on cholesterol. And so anyway, Zuby, there's a lot there, but part of my opposition to calorie counting
Yeah,
is
yeah, I
certainly
get it.
based on my view that it encourages a wrong focus. That I think there's certainly value in appreciating the composition of what you're eating. Um, and so in that sense, perhaps calorie counting can have some value. But if the person is trained to fear those calories, then I worry that it's going to just continue this fat phobic culture and this obsession with carbs because carbs have fewer calories, with a total
Okay, I get you.
ignorance
I get you.
of the hormonal or endocrine relevance there. So, maybe in an ideal world, there would be a new metric that, rather than focusing on calories, you we could look at the insulin index, or or a hybrid, because again, calories matter, but there has to be an insulin response to tell those calories to be stored as fat. I guess in the most ideal scenario, it would be some number that was an algorithmic sort of, here's the insulin effect of what you're about to eat, here's the calories that come with it, and together, here's the score that is going to let you understand how likely it is that you're going to store this. Like high carb, high fat, boy, you have the insulin response.
Bad combo.
Oh, that's a hell of a combo, but it's delicious, of course. But what's so interesting is, of course, that humans have no evidence of addiction to fat and protein. Um, Unlike rodents, mice appear to have an addiction to fat that humans do not have. So we have to be careful with rodent evidence. But humans, if you look at the whole realm of the neurobiology of food addiction, it always comes back to one single macronutrient, which is carbohydrates. With or without fat, people will crave that, or even indeed be addicted to it. That's why I think with calorie counting, it can just lead us down some faulty roads. Not that it doesn't have value, it can.
I hear that. I hear that. Um, with what you were talking about before in terms of the metric that would measure sort of impact on insulin, isn't that sort of what the glycemic index is supposed to be, or is that something different?
Yeah, yeah, almost. So the glycemic index is the sort of poor man's measurement of another one called the glycemic load, which is a better metric, because it includes the actual amount of carb in what you're eating. Whereas the glycemic index just assumes a sort of standard amount across all things. So the glycemic load is the best measurement at estimating how much is this going to increase your blood glucose. But even then, that itself is not a perfect surrogate for what's going to happen to your insulin, because you and I, in fact, this comes back to muscle mass. The more someone has elevated muscle mass, the more they have this enormous sink. Now, by sink, I mean like a term of physics, something that can absorb a lot of stuff. Muscle consumes, even in a normal person without a lot of muscle mass, 80%. If someone's wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and I'm a huge advocate of CGMs because it lets you know what your body's doing in response to what you're eating. When someone eats something and they see on their CGM the glucose comes up and then it eventually starts to come back down, 80% of that drop is because of what's going into muscle. Muscle just loves pulling in glucose. And if you have more muscle, you can have that, you can eat a given load of carbohydrate and have your glucose come up and down much more quickly. In part because insulin will come up. Insulin has all of these muscle cells where it can go to the muscle cell, knock on the door, and say, "Hey, I got a bunch of glucose here. I need you to pull it in." Naturally, the more muscle cells there are, or the bigger they are, to say that more precisely, the more entrances there is for glucose to come in. The less muscle mass, the more the glucose stays elevated, and then most importantly, the more the insulin stays elevated, because the insulin just keeps knocking on the same doors, saying, "Hey, I got all this glucose. I need to put it somewhere." And if you have less muscle mass, there's simply less storage depots for the glucose to go into. So, to echo your words earlier, I am an enormous advocate of resistance training. Indeed, minute for minute, resistance training is going to improve insulin sensitivity more than any amount of aerobic exercise. And if you look at all of the key metrics of longevity, and I know I've gotten off on a tangent here, almost all of them are related. They're all related to strength and muscle mass. So that's, I mean, I cannot emphasize it enough.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the way I'm understanding this as well, the thing you were just talking about. So of course, both in the liver and in muscles, we store glycogen. So when you're talking about glucose being shuttled into your muscles, I mean, another thing, of course, is if you're weight training and exercising a lot, you're constantly depleting your glycogen reserves. So when you do have those additional carbohydrates, whether they're starches or sugars, there is a semi-empty silo for them to
Hmm.
enter. Whereas if you're not exercising regularly, your stores are already full, and then you're eating more and more carbohydrates, which are turning into sugar, and your reserves are already full. So, to my understanding, either that's going to get converted into fat and stored somewhere in your body, um, and you're also just going to have elevated blood sugar and um, decreased insulin sensitivity because you're just constantly staying elevated. I think
Yeah.
sometimes I forget. I've been into training for so long and nutrition for so, like, it's just part of my lifestyle to the point where, like, I don't think about it that much, and I often forget how little exercise most people do. I forget that most people don't work out, most people don't lift weights,
Yes.
most people are very sedentary, and most people are just eating rubbish all day long. Like I kind of forget how bad the modern lifestyle and diet are.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. Some of the things that you're saying, I sort of know them to be correct, but I'm also like, there's a caveat where if you are someone who is active and is training, you have a lot more leeway.
Yes, you do. You do. Yeah, yeah, muscle mass is the great forgiver. Yeah, it can sort of absolve you of a lot of metabolic sin when it comes to traditional lifestyle. But this is one of the reasons why I approach the weight loss drugs that I mentioned earlier, Wegovy and Ozempic, as much as they have become a topic of obsession, and rightly so. The results are remarkable, but there are aspects of these drugs that are not appreciated, including the topic we're discussing now, which is the loss of muscle mass. That these drugs, a paper published in 2021 in the New England Journal of Medicine found that up to 40% of the weight loss that people experience on these drugs, even at a relatively modest dose, is coming from fat-free mass, including muscle and bone mass. And you are the less muscle and bone you have in particular, the greater the struggle is going to become to not only age well, again, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. The key metrics of longevity are actually heavily based on strength and muscle mass. So not only are you accelerating your aging or mortality, but you're also depriving yourself of the greatest metabolic advocate you can have in your body, namely muscle mass. So that is in my mind, that is one of the most overlooked aspects of these drugs. That in the midst of all this enthusiasm, which I understand, I truly do, although I still don't think they're being approached correctly, but the loss of muscle is one of the greatest reasons I believe we need to discuss these with a little more caution to balance out some of the enthusiasm.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Because essentially, if you're losing a lot of lean body mass, then it's like taking wood out of the furnace, right? Um, because the more lean body mass you have, even when you're sitting on your butt doing nothing, even when you're lying asleep, whatever you're doing, you're going to be burning you're going to be burning through more energy, burning through more calories. So if you take the wood out of that fire through through reckless weight loss or through using some of these drugs, whatever the case may be, then when you come off of them or you go back to eating normally, then you get this yo-yo effect. I mean, this happens
Oh
even
yeah.
without the drugs, right?
Yeah.
When people just lose, when people don't focus on fat loss and they focus on weight loss, and they start eating through their muscle mass, they start eating through their lean body mass, then they normally will switch back after the crash diet and they go back to how they were eating before. And actually now their basal metabolic rate has dropped. And so they tend to yo-yo back up
Yeah.
because they're now not burning through this. So
Yeah.
it's a fascinating thing because I think in our worlds, a lot of this is somewhat obvious, but for the average person who does not look into this stuff or study it or
Hmm.
anything like that, then I think it's
Yeah.
quite mind blowing.
It's easier to see it all in a much rosier perspective. But in fact, Zuby, I actually think you described a milder scenario, which is the traditional scenario
Okay.
with yo-yo dieting, where you lose weight and metabolic rate will come down, and then it makes it easier to regain that weight when you get off the diet. Again, I think part of the problem is when you're just focusing on reducing calories, you stimulate hunger, like I mentioned earlier. So you're almost destined.
Mm.
Like, I mean, case in point, The Biggest Loser game show in the US, you never see the reunion tour because they gain it all back. That's the dirty little secret. But with these weight loss drugs, in fact, I think it even goes one step further because of not only how likely the person is to get off the drug, but then the metabolic state after, which I think is even worse than the one you just outlined, as it goes with traditional yo-yo dieting. But just to emphasize that first point, 70% in the US, it was found that 70% of patients get off the drug at 24 months of their own volition for various reasons, but they decide themselves that they no longer want to be on the drug. In most instances, it's because they cite the nausea, which to paint that in a polite way, they say that my cravings went away. Yes, it's because you feel kind of nauseous all the time. And so at 24 months, 70% of people choose to get off the drugs. Even in a separate study, this is called the step 5 trial. This was in 2023. These scientists found that at 24 months, even the people who stayed on the drug, their sweet cravings had gone back to normal. That at first, at 6 months, their sweet cravings were down. At 1 year, their sweet cravings were even further reduced. And then over that next year, their sweet cravings creeped back up, even though they were still on the drug. There's this phenomenon of diminishing returns where at 24 months, their sweet cravings were right back where they were before. So, through a combination of either the return of the cravings or they get off the drug, they're going to go back to eating the way they did before. But now, imagine, if you will, someone like a 60-year-old woman or even younger. We don't even have to be that dramatic. Let's say a 45-year-old woman in particular. Now, I only mention the female sex because of the the complication of menopause, which accelerates bone loss and muscle loss. But let's imagine a 45, 50-year-old woman who gets on this drug. 40% of the weight that she's lost is coming from fat-free mass, including muscle and bone. That is mass that she likely will never get back. So if you look at these two compositions that was measured in the 2021 study, fat mass and fat-free mass, for every 10 kilograms the person's lost, 6 came from fat, 4 came from fat-free mass. When the person gets off the drug or the drug stops working as well, which is why people begin to double dose and potentially kill themselves because their intestines paralyze. So one of these fat masses will return immediately. One of these masses, the fat mass will bounce back immediately. Good luck regaining that lost muscle and bone. It is likely the person will never regain it. And thus they are. I mean, talk about this complication here. Yes, they have the reduced metabolic rate that went along with the yo-yo dieting scenario you mentioned earlier, but now they compound that with a potential irreversible loss of muscle and bone. Now, none of this is to say that I'm universally opposed to these drugs. I'm not. I actually think they can play a role. I just find that my voice ends up sounding so negative on the topic because there are so few people elaborating or elucidating the consequences, that I just feel there needs to be. This conversation is more nuanced than get on the drug and it'll change the world. Yeah, maybe, but not for the best, perhaps. That we just have to consider these other factors, that there can be a role for the drug, but I think the way it is being prescribed, how haphazardly it is, and without a focus on maintaining muscle. Everyone who gets on these drugs should leave their office with not only on the lowest dose, but with a prescription for weight training that we've got, and maybe a supplement regime. Here's your prescription for adequate whey protein with healthy fats. Here's your prescription for a certain amount of creatine to help with your workouts, and whatever else we need to do. We've got to try to offset some of the negative consequences, because we're only talking about the good ones within the whole realm of social media. And I understand those. I get the temptation to do that, but there has to be some voices that are saying, yeah, but as much as it seems like I'm being a downer, I don't mean to be, but there is a nuance, there's a consideration that needs to be viewed when these drugs are discussed.
Yeah. So if I extrapolate what you're saying, we shouldn't be shocked if there's a rise in things like osteoporosis over the next coming decades, because that's what
Yes.
it's looking like. Ben. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of political correctness, and I'm a big fan of common sense. And so many of these things, like if we kind of cut to the root of it, and I don't want to, I'm not saying this to try to offend people, but people are lazy. And
Oh
this is
yeah.
a lot. This is the really like this is really at the root of a lot of these problems, right? I think a lot of this enthusiasm for Ozempic and these similar drugs, a lot of it is rooted in laziness. People want this magic bullet. People want something. I think that's why people want to believe. I
Yeah.
just want to believe that it's
Yeah.
all upside and there's no downside, and
They
long
want
term it's all going to be
self-discipline
totally
in a
fine.
syringe, and it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, no, no, it doesn't. I mean, again, I'm no doctor, but I'm someone with common sense, and it seems the thing that seems obvious to me at this point is, look, if you've got someone who is morbidly obese and they're putting their whole body and life is at massive risk, then I think these drugs temporarily would most likely on balance be a net positive for them, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're just okay, like, obesity is going to kill you if you don't lose this weight
Yeah,
quickly and you're
especially
struggling through
especially
these
combined
other
with some
mechanisms.
nutrition coaching. And that's sort of the
Yes.
only thing I would add. Like, let's say we're going to give you this drug at the lowest dose to help you overcome some of your eating addictions, but at the same time,
Mhm.
we're going to give you some dietary nutrition counseling, control carbs, prioritize
Yeah.
protein, don't fear fat, and weight and resistance training. And here's your personal trainer. That to me would be the most ideal combination for the person in the exact scenario you just described.
Yeah, and again, my common sense and not intuition, I mean, this is a logical deduction, would also tell me that if you're someone who is not that overweight or not overweight at all, um, I think almost like the less overweight you are, the more risky those drugs are likely to be. Also, because you can't afford to lose the lean body mass. Say someone like myself who's already in good shape and maybe, oh, I want to lose 10 pounds to, get a, have my six pack a little bit sharper on the beach or something. For someone like myself to get on Ozempic, like I imagine that lean body mass loss is not going to be 40%. It's probably going to be like eating 70-80% of it. So the scale weight might go down, but in terms of my muscle mass, my physical performance, even my appearance, um, who knows? Maybe I'd even end up there's a probability I might even end up being fat, like getting almost like I wonder. Here's an interesting one. I wonder if I could even end up losing weight, but
as a
having a
percent be
higher
fatter.
body fat percentage.
Yeah, in fact,
Yeah,
Zuby, that's
yeah.
exactly that is exactly my worry, that as much as with the loss of lean mass that we just got done describing, that even though the person, when they get off the drug at 1 year, they may still say, "Oh, well, at least I'm still 5 kilograms less than I was before." Yeah, but you're actually probably fatter. But Zuby, a paper, speaking of you, like in reasonably healthy men who get on these high dose GLP-1 receptor activators or agonists, a paper was just published like within the last 2 weeks that found that in men, these are non-diabetic men but overweight using the drug, their risk of developing low testosterone was 2 times higher than the placebo group, and their risk of developing erectile dysfunction was 5 times higher. These are substantial concerns. So a 5 times greater risk in erectile dysfunction, 2 times greater risk of low testosterone.
Ben, we've talked about so many intriguing things here. So, for people who are listening, we've touched on, I think we've already given some of these answers, but maybe we can summarize it a little bit. For the person who is listening to this, man or woman, maybe they're a little bit overweight, maybe they're very overweight, maybe they're concerned about their health, maybe they're thinking, okay, I'm hearing all this, but how should I approach my diet, my exercise routine, my lifestyle in general, particularly if they're busy? I know a lot of my listeners, most people have jobs, most people have children, life is busy. So, given all of that, do you have a recommendation or set of recommendations for them so that they don't get overwhelmed with all the complexity of all this stuff and they can just get started and start improving their lives?
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, I'm delighted to have that be the topic at the moment. In fact, you described me. Like I think I'm a busy dad with young kids at home. I'm busy in my church. I'm busy with my career as a professor and consulting. And not that anyone wants to look like a middle-aged freckled bald guy, but I've maintained very good metabolic health, and it really is. We have talked about them, but to sum it up, I would perhaps most succinctly narrow it down to two things, which would be control carbs. Now, again, I'm not saying you can't eat any, but the better you're able to control your insulin, the more easily it's going to be for your body to lose weight. Don't, I mean, just simplest principles, control carbs. And if you need that even one step simpler, don't get your carbs from bags and boxes with barcodes. Eat whole fruits and vegetables, enjoy them, steam them, stew them, whatever. Eat them, don't drink them. And then the second one is at least 6 times a week, engage in some form of resistance training, even if it is little like exercise snacks. Like, for example, behind me on the floor, I have what's called these little parallettes, kind of longer little push up bars. And I will make sure that I do 100 push ups every day before I leave my office, just little bits at a time, just as one example. And of course, I go work out every morning, but find some protected time where you can do some resistance training, however that may look. Any form that you can do it is the best way to do it. So if you're asking, well, what's the best way to lift weights? However you can do it. If it's doing push-ups in your office or at home and doing wall sits and squats, do it. If you can get to the gym, do it. I just do body weight exercises and it has worked wonderfully for me. Just do it. So keep your muscle for all the reasons we've elaborated. And then just maybe a personal insert there, because those are my answers: control carbs and lift heavy stuff, including your own body. But part of my motivation is, yes, I want to look good. I want my wife to find me attractive, in particular, of course, as blind as she may need to be to do so. But I also I live for more than myself now. I mean, the moment my first daughter was born 17 years ago, that was one of the most profound moments of my life. That when I looked at her cherubic little newborn face, in a way, I saw my immortality. I saw me existing forever in my offspring and their offspring and their offspring's offspring. And I thought in that moment, as a new dad, one of my first thoughts was, I want to be the best grandpa that I can be. And as my kids are getting older and I find that I miss having babies around so desperately, that desire even grows. And so as I anticipate the glorious day when my children make me a grandpa, um, God willing, may that happen. I want to be a very involved grandpa. I want to ski with my grandkids. I want to play with my grandkids. I want to wrestle with them. I want to be able to get up and off the ground. I want to hold them and throw them in the air. That is an enormous motivator for me to lift weights, because running won't do that, especially in men. Especially in men. Men, the more men run, the scrawnier and more wasted they become. Men need muscle. And one of the things I try to encourage my young male undergraduate students, I want them to be these wonderful, generous, gentlemanly alpha males whose singular motivation in life, while they're learning physiology and cell biology from me, it's a means to an end. And I tell them this, and I can tell them this because I'm at a private religious university. I said, all of this is a means to an end. You're getting a training to have a job. Let that job be for the purpose of being a provider and a protector. Your profession will help you be a provider, but you need to be physically strong. You need to be emotionally resilient and socially capable. That's going to help you protect the family as well. And so I look at men whose entire exercise regime is just running, and I groan. Men waste away when their whole exercise routine is running. You have to lift, but the same goes for women. Keep muscle mass for all the reasons we've mentioned.
Ben, I love that. You're absolutely speaking my language. You've given, I think, three things there. For my listeners, I want to give three as well that I think are important just in terms of practical ways of thinking. One of them I want to follow on from something you said there that's so important, because so many people are parents, and that's awesome. Shout out to all the parents who are listening. I want to say, use your kids as a reason, not as an excuse.
Oh, good. Well
And
said.
I think that summarizes what you said. Another way, when it comes to nutrition, I like to say, if it grows, eat it.
Yeah, good.
Right. So if it grows, right, if it grows, it's probably something you should. If it's
Yeah.
coming out of box, coming out of a packet, something like, right. If your ancestors wouldn't even recognize it as food, probably a bit of an amber or a red flag. And then the last one I'll say, again, just following on from your brilliant advice, there is, something is better than nothing. I think the reason a lot of people don't exercise when they get busy is because they think, I don't have an hour, I don't have 2 hours to go to the gym. You don't need hours and hours. Something is better than nothing. If in a day all you can do is get 10 minutes, if all you can do is 5 minutes, 5 minutes is infinitely more than 0 minutes.
Mhm.
Sometimes, you go to the gym, you just got to rush it. You just got 25 minutes. A 25-minute workout is infinitely better than no workout. So I just want to encourage people to do what you can. We recognize life gets busy sometimes. Life gets busy. Sometimes it's always busy, but don't have this all or nothing approach. Same goes with nutrition, right? Don't If you have one bad meal, don't let it turn
Yeah.
into a whole bad week. Just get back on the horse and keep on going. So, man, Ben, I've loved talking to you so much. You're such a wise guy. I've learned. I've done a lot of podcasts. I've done hundreds and hundreds of podcasts, and um, it becomes increasingly rare where you really feel like you learn something totally new. And I feel like I've learned several new things here, and I'm sure my
Right.
listeners have as well. Where can people find and follow you online? And also, shout out your book. Where
Mhm.
can they get it?
Yeah, yeah. Hey, thanks, Zuby. Well, nothing warms a professor's heart more than having a new crop of students to teach. So thanks. I'm glad you feel like you've learned something. Yeah, so people can find me. I'm active on social media purely for the sake of educational content. I like people to understand basic research from a scientist who studies metabolism. So I'm active on social media with the handle Ben Bikman, PhD. And then also, I have an increasing amount of educational content at my website, benbikman.com. And Bikman is just Bikman, no C, benbikman.com. And then, yeah, thanks. My books. The first book is Why We Get Sick, which is really just a primer on what is insulin resistance, where does it come from, why it matters, and what to do about it. And then my follow up book is How Not to Get Sick, which is more of the kind of science behind implementing strategies to help, essentially to help shrink fat cells. And I lay out that viewpoint that I've already articulated here. But you can get those two books anywhere books are sold. But again, the best place is the benbikman.com.
Awesome. Ben, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's
My
been a pleasure.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.